Hey everybody, my name is Gavin Kennedy, and today I will be walking you through the topics of secure email protocols, specifically POP3s and SMTPS, along with how to configure and harden them using three common mail server platforms, dovecot, IIS, and postfix. So we're going to go and start with the agenda for today's video. We are first going to start with a overview of pop3s, which is a secure version of Post Office Plug Protocol. Then we're going to go through how to configure it with dovecot on Linux, followed by some specific hardening recommendations that will strengthen its security. And then after that, we will move on to SMTPS, which is the secure form of SFTP. We'll look at what it is, then we will walk through the configuration on the two different platforms. First, IIS on Windows Server, and then postfix on Linux. And finally, I will cover general hardening recommendations for both IIS and postfix to help you secure those servers against common threats. And then at the very end, I will go ahead and wrap up with a summary and some key takeaways. All right, so let's start with POP3s. So POP3 itself is a simple mail retriever protocol that allows a client to download messages from the mail server, but by default, POP3 will only send everything in just plain text, which ends up being a major security risk. So to address this, we have POP3s, which is just POP3 wrapped in SSL and TLS, and then POP3s typically runs on port 995. By using encryptions, it will ensure both the credentials and the contents of the emails are protected as they move from the server to the client. And this is especially useful in cases where IMAP just isn't needed. And POP3 is a lightweight and straightforward, and POP3s makes it secure. And in many small and legacy environments, POP3s is still common because it's simple. It's essentially you get mail, you download it, and that's it, as opposed to IMAP, which will sync across any system. But regardless of what protocol you use, encryption is a non-negotiable today, and that's where POP3s comes in. All right, so now let's talk about the configuration, specifically with dovecot on Linux. Dovecot is one of the more popular open source mail delivery agents for Linux. It's known for being lightweight, flexible, and secure when it's properly configured. And to enable POP3s, the process involves just a few steps. So first, you would want to make sure the dovecot packages are installed. This essentially adds POP3 functionality to your server. And then second, you would update the configuration file to enable POP3 and POP3s alongside IMAP if that's something that you need. And this would tell dovecot which protocols to support. And then third, you would configure the SSL setting. This means pointing dovecot to the location of your SSL certificate and private key. And then these files would provide the encryption layer that turns POP3 into POP3s. And then finally, you would just restart dovecot service so the changes would take effect. Um, and then at that point, the server is capable of accepting secure POP3s connections from the clients. And of course, just like everything else, just enabling SSL wouldn't be enough. You would need to use hardening configurations to make sure it holds up against any real world threats. So here are the best 5 practices for hardening dovecot. So the first would be to enforce a strong TLS. This means disabling the weak and outdated protocols such as SSL v2, SSL v3, and TLS 1.0, and only allow TLS 1.2 or above. And then you would want to use a modern cipher suite that supports perfect forward secrecy. And then the second would be to use a proper certificate management, always use certificates from a trusted certificate authority instead of the self-signed ones, unless you are purely just in the test environment. And also make sure the private key files are tightly permissioned so only root access can use them. And three would to be disable plain text authentication or insecure ports. So clients should only be able to authenticate TLS in one place. This would ensure that the usernames and passwords are never exposed in the open. Four would be to defend against any brute force attacks. So tools like fail to ban can monitor logs and repeated failed safe attempt login attempts that would automatically block the offending IP addresses, and this would significantly reduce the risk of any password guessing attacks. And then lastly, um, the limit privileges and secure file permissions. So dovecot should run only with the permissions if needed, and all the other configuration and mail storage files should be carefully locked down. And of course, keeping the software itself updated is a very critical to patch any known vulnerabilities. All right, so now let's shift gears over to SMTPS. SMTP, as you would know, is the protocol used to send emails between servers and the from clients to servers. So, like POP3, it was originally designed without encryption. So SMTPS refers to using SMTP over TLS. There are two common versions of this. One is implicit TLS, which uses port 465 and expects encryption immediately. And the other is start TLS, which upgrades a plaintext SMTP session to a secure one, usually on port 25 or 587. And SMTPS ensures that both the message content and the authentication credentials are encrypted during submission or relay. And without it, the attackers could easily capture sensitive information in transit. So for this presentation, I will be showing you how SMTPS is configured on two major platforms, that being ISS on Windows and postfix on Linux. All right, so let's start with IIS. So Windows Server comes with a SMTP service, although it is somewhat legacy compared to some modern alternatives. Still, many organizations may continue to use it. And the general purpose or process of enabling SMTPS here starts with adding the SMTP server feature through the server manager that will install the service. And then next you would install a server certificate into the local machine certificate store. This is what IIS will use to provide TLS encryption. And then you would go into the IIS SMTP virtual server settings. And then under the access and outbound security properties, you would enable the TLS so the connections are secured. And finally, you would configure the authentication requirements and relay restrictions. This would mean deciding who can send mail through the server, requiring them to use the TLS when doing so. And then depending on which version of Windows Server you're working with, the menus and options may just look a little bit different, but overall the flow would remain the same. That would be enabling the SMTP, assign a certificate, and then turn on the TLS, and lock down any authentication and relay. And so here are some key ways to harden the IIS SMTP. So first would be to require the TLS for all authentication and submissions using a trusted CA signed certificate. Second would be strictly control relay permissions. So only authenticated users or known IP addresses should be allowed to relay mail. Open relays are one of the biggest sources of spam. And third would be to enable detailed logging and monitoring so you can track any abnormal activity and use a firewall rule to block or filter the abusive connections. Fourth would be to keep Windows itself patched and minimize any unnecessary roles or features to reduce the attack surface. And then also to make sure the SMTP service is running with the least privilege needed. And finally would be to add the layers of protection at the mail level. So this would include enforcing the outbound TLS when possible, and then publishing the SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records so your messages can't be easily spoofed. All right, and so now we're going to look at postfix on Linux, which is one of the most widely used mail transfer agents in the world. So to enable SMTPS, you would begin by pointing postfix to your SSL certificate and the configuration file, and this will be what would allow it to support the TLS encryption. Then when you would enable the submission port, port 587 is the standard submission port for the clients, while port 465 is used for the implicit TLS. And then to activate port 465, you would edit the service configuration to run a wrapper mode around the TLS enabled. And then finally, with dovecot, you would restart the postfix service to apply the changes. And then at that point, the postfix will be ready to accept any secure client submissions using TLS. So the hardening postfix follows the same principles as with dovecot and IIS, but with some Linux-specific considerations. So the first one would be to enforce the minimum TLS versions and strong ciphers. This would prevent the attackers from downgrading the connections to something insecure. Second would be to require authentication or submission ports, so only trusted users could be allowed to send mail through the server. You can also set the recipient restrictions and rate limits to help prevent any abuse. Third would be to implement additional anti-abuse controls like SPF, DKIM, or DMARC, real-time black hole lists, and spam filters. And all these measures can help stop the server from being used for any malicious activity. The fourth would be to protect against brute force login attempts by using fail to ban or similar tools and set per user or per IP rate limits. And lastly, would keep postfix updated and run it with the least privilege needed. Where possible, isolate it in the chroot jail or containers so that even if it's compromised, the damage would be limited. So to wrap everything up, let's quickly review the main points. For a secure email retrieval, pop3s should always be used instead of just plain pop3. Dovecot makes it relatively straightforward to configure pop3s, but must be hardened the configuration by enforcing modern TLS, managing the certificates properly, and blocking the brute force attempts. For secure email submissions, SMTPS or Start TLS should be used. And then on Windows, IIS, SMTP can be configured with TLS, though you want to be very careful with hardening to prevent any abuse. On Linux, postfix offers flexible and powerful SMTP support, but again, it must be locked down with proper authentication, TLS enforcement, and any anti-abuse measures. The common thread across all of these platforms is that enabling TLS is just step one. True security comes from the combination of strong encryption, tight authentication, careful certificate management, proactive monitoring, and using least privilege principles.